Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Lydia and today I'm going to show you how to make the Ann Puff wrap blouse, but from scratch. This is my original shirt that I made from a men's shirt. It was requested that I make a pattern, so I made a pattern, and then it was requested that I show you how to make it from a bolt of fabric rather than a shirt. So today I'm going to show you that. If you want to know how to make this blouse from a shirt, I suggest following the original video, but also follow this one because it's a little more clear in how to put it together. So without further ado, let's get started! This blouse design is a wrap top with side darts at the front and waist darts at the back. The sleeve is 3/4 length and has 2 pieces. The underpiece is designed to be sewn in a contrasting textile. I would love to see your creations. Tag me or DM me an image on my Instagram anytime. This pattern comes in size 0 to 20. Be sure to first view the instructions file as it provides the size chart, flat pattern measurements, material estimates, and so on. I always recommend that you do a sample in some test fabric, at least the bodice area, so that you can be sure it will fit you, and if you need to tweak anything, you can do that before sewing in your final fabric. The pattern comes in 2 US letter and A4 compatible files. There are also copy shop files in A0 size, and these sizes are in layers, so definitely refer to my tutorial link below for how to print, paste, and store your PDF patterns. For my materials, I chose this beautiful 44-inch wide batik cotton and this bright red 42-inch wide linen for my contrasting pieces, and matching red thread to sew it all with. I had about 2.5 yards of the cotton and a yard of the linen. I'm making my blouse in a size 8, and so I used about 2 yards in terms of length, mostly because of the length of the long strap. There was still a lot of fabric left within the 2 yards length that I used. For the red, I used up the full length but also had quite a bit left over. Both fabrics were pre-shrunk as I put them through a wash cycle and tumble dry. I cut the front and back bodice, top sleeve, and one of each left and right waist wrap in the batik. I cut everything out flat, making sure that I cut each piece opposite to the other. Be sure to keep an eye on the pieces that indicate to cut on fold. I cut the undersleeve, cuffs, front and back facing, and one of each left and right waist wrap in the linen. The longer waist wrap didn't fit in this bolt of fabric, so I added a piece where it would be hidden on the body. Make sure that you snip all the notches. It will mitigate confusion and make your construction process much smoother. To begin constructing the blouse, take your front bodice and sew the darts on the wrong side of the fabric. Press the dart bulk toward the hem. Take your back bodice and sew the 2 waist darts. Press the dart bulk inward. After this, you can overlock or use a zigzag stitch to finish the raw edges of your pieces. You only need to overlock the highlighted areas. Everything else will be enclosed. Make sure you are still able to see your notches. I stretch the fabric while I sew so that the notches open, and therefore they will be much easier to locate while sewing. That's my little peppercorn. She can't resist rolling around in my fabric any chance she can get. With the right side of your back bodice facing up, place the right side of your front bodice pieces on top, lining up the shoulders to sew this seam. Do the same for your facing pieces.
Hey! Ow!
The top of your front facing piece is indicated with a notch so that you don't get confused. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once sewn, press these seams open and flat, then with the right side of your bodice facing up, place the right side of your assembled facing to the bodice neckline. Sew the seam at 1/2 inch. Trim down to 1/4 inch and clip the curve of the neckline. This helps it to lay flat when turned out. Next you want to understitch, so that means stitching the facing to the seam allowance at about 1/16 of an inch or more if you're not comfortable with that tiny of a stitch. This just keeps the facing from popping out while wearing it. Press everything flat. And lastly, stitch the facing to the shoulders by doing a small backstitch in the seam of your shoulder. It is virtually invisible. With your facing complete, we move on to the waist wraps. I applied my shorter waist wrap to the left side, left as in when you look at it, not left on the body. You can easily switch this up if you prefer. There are 2 notches on the waist wrap. The further notch lines up with the edge of the bodice. The one that is closer to the side seam is the center front notch and lines up with the center front notch on the blouse. This is labeled on the pattern with a CF. Sandwich the bodice between the right sides of the waist wrap, matching the notches and pinning it in place. When you sew, you're going to sew around the base to the point of the wrap, then back around towards the blouse. When you get to the edge of the blouse, you can stuff the blouse in between the waist wraps and finish the waist wrap seam. It really beats having to fold and understitch to finish. Do the exact same steps for the other side. They only differ in length but are identical in construction. You'll see as I sew how easy it is to push the bodice bulk inside the sash as you finish it up. Of course, the thicker your fabric, the more challenging it could be, but it's quite manageable. After this, trim the points of the waist wraps. Then you can take a knitting needle, chopstick, or other skinny pointed stick and push it into the point of the waist wrap, turning it out easily. Finish it off with a nice press, and we're on to the next step. Turn up the back bodice hem 1/4 inch twice and sew. Then with right sides together, sew up the side seams. On the side opposite your long waist wrap, you're going to leave a small opening near the base of the bodice. This is indicated by notches on your back bodice piece. Reinforce these stitches with a robust back stitch, as this area will get a lot of wear and tear. When you have sewn this gap, open it up, lay it flat, and sew a small rectangle around it for a clean finish and easier access. And here I'll give you a little sneak peek on how it's supposed to be wrapped. We have completed the bodice, now let's move on to the puffy sleeves. Start with pre-ironing the cuffs. Iron in half lengthwise according to the notches, then iron up one side a little less than 1/2 inch. This will help you stitch in the ditch later. With your machine stitch length dial turned to its max length, sew 2 rows of stitching along the cap of your top sleeve inside its 1/2-inch seam allowance. Mark your center notch with a pin lest it get lost in the many gathers. Then gather your sleeve. You can gather it almost as far as it will go. It's easier to let out gathers than to tighten them in this particular construction. Once gathered, locate the double notches on the sides of both the top and undersleeve. You can either match the sleeve pieces right sides together at the back that have the double notches, like I did, or you could sew the front seam first, which is the side that doesn't have any notches. Whichever seam you sew first, press the seam open, then sew a pair of gathered stitches at the base of the sleeve. Then gather according to your cuff length. Now I'm going to show you 2 methods of finishing the sleeve. If you choose the first method, it will be better if you had sewn the front seam of your top and undersleeve first, leaving the back seam open for this step. Start with sewing the unfolded end of your cuff right sides together to the sleeve hem. Match the open seam, including the cuff, right sides together and sew the full length, lining up the seams of the cuff accurately. Once complete, iron open the seam and fold back the cuff, lining it up just a 1/16 to an 1/8 past your original seam. Stitch in the ditch on the face of the fabric. For method 2, you're going to place the remaining open seams right sides together and the cuff right side together and sew them separately. After ironing open your seams, match the cuff seam to the center of your undersleeve and the center notch to the center of the top sleeve with the right sides together and sew. Then fold in your cuff, and like the first method I showed on the other sleeve, line up the fold of the cuff just over the original cuff seam and stitch in the ditch to finish. Your sleeves are complete, now let's sew them to the body. There's a center notch on the undersleeve panel, match it to the side seam of the bodice. Also make sure that your single notch on the sleeve is at the front and the double notch on the sleeve is at the back of the bodice. Also match the center notch at the cap of the sleeve. Adjust the gathers of the sleeve to match the armhole and sew at 1/2 inch.